From finance too.
Above the shale. My concern here is not with contamination reaching these receptors during the fracking operation. The contaminant is not going to travel on a 5-day period from the formation to a surface aquifer. And one of the analyses in that environmental impact statement basically said it couldn't happen because contaminants aren't going to flow in 5 days from the formation to the surface, and that seemed kind of like almost a ludicrous argument against it, because there's really no hydraulic connection established within that 5-day period. It's more of the problem is that you have a huge gradient established from the shale formation to just outside the formation. And if any of those fractures, be it induced by fracking or be it the existing fractures in the shale and surrounding material, as they are enhanced, will force some of that fluid outside the formation, and then it's just a matter of it getting to the surface, either straight up or down or along a pathway somewhere. I had done an analysis and considered, many different potential scenarios, and found, using a groundwater transport model, this is the type of thing that could occur anywhere. It could take 10 years for the contaminants to reach a receptor. Could take a lot longer. It depends on the conditions. I mean, around the mining industry, I've seen movement of mercury of 1,000 feet in 2 years. That's a fair amount of contamination moving rather quickly. Not exactly the same geology, but the possibility exists. So what do we do about that type of thing? How do we handle that long-term potential long-term issues? And that's where I think we need to have some regional monitoring. I think someone called a little while ago mentioned that we need to. Actually, I believe one of Ben's suggestions was test wells. I would add to it that we need to have, that there needs to be some monitoring wells designed so that we can track the movement of any plumes coming from the shale or from the well bores and moving toward a receptor. I mean, they monitor around hard rock mines for as much as 100 years after the mine closes. I think we need to, it's not unreasonable, especially considering the toxicity of some of the material that could be released from the formation, that it's not unreasonable to keep an eye on it for a long time into the future. Public confidence, I think, demands it. To have public support, it requires the public to have confidence in these operations. I mean, the industry has very sophisticated fracking models, and as has been pointed out, those models can be thrown off by the faults and heterogeneities. Nonlinear chaos is what Ben called it, and a windshield cracking. It reminded me that when my windshield cracked a couple of months ago, there was nothing predictable or controlled about it. It definitely went a distance, and I would not have expected it to go that way. So anyhow, I would say that we need to improve the monitoring of movement around, of contaminant movement around the formations, but also the fracking models must be validated, and it must be done publicly. It must be done in some of these environmental documents, not strictly proprietarily, which is what I've seen before. I tried to take a look at models, at some of the fracking models when I was reviewing the environmental impact statement, and could frankly not find much information about where they've gone, where the industry has gone down and actually done, taken a look at and examined how the fracturing occurs after a fracking operation. Thank you.
Chris Tucker. Chris Tucker is Vice President of FD Public Affairs, and he's the Communications Director for Energy in Depth, a Washington, D.C. based outreach and education project created by the Independent Petroleum Association of America.
Hello, Chris Tucker. Did I hear that? Okay. My name is Chris Tucker. I am the Communications Director for Energy in Depth. We're based in Washington, D.C. I'm actually from Pennsylvania as well, so I think we have sort of 3 of us here from PA, at least, maybe more. I don't know. We sort of all came up on the same train, I think. But Energy in Depth, real quick, we mentioned before, we're an education and outreach campaign that was created in the middle part of 2008 by the Independent Petroleum Association of America. They're the small sort of independent oil and gas producers across the country. I should just quickly say before Tom, I want to mention Tom, because he mentioned about the mapping of fractures and sort of the sophisticated equipment that's used in the frac trucks and sort of, again, the modeling. I actually brought with me a couple modeling scenarios here that were put together by a group called Pinnacle Technologies, which released this information in July. Pinnacle is owned by Halliburton, so it is an industry source, but they've, over the past 10 years here, mapped their fractures in the Barnett and the Marcellus, and essentially they mapped the deepest water aquifer, and then relative to the most shallow fracture, and found quite significant points of separation here. I think, it was interesting, the focus of Ben's paper and Professor Mile and Mr. Myers, I really did focus on this concept of the communication between the communication of the water table and the fracture stimulation zone. And I have to say, Professor Ingraffia cited in your paper as well, I've talked to plenty of geologists. I'm not a geologist, I'm not a hydrologist, I'm not going to pretend to be one for this panel, but I do, in my work in sort of the last 2.5 years, basically working this issue full time, I've been talking to folks of the geologists and hydrologists really across the country. It's sort of a minority viewpoint, this idea that we're, especially in areas where we're talking about fracturing 7,000 feet deep, and where water tables are 300, 400, 500, maybe down to 700 feet, and that there's this idea that even with existing fracture networks, there's not enough pressure to exert on the water table so that you're going to get up and create these fissures that can connect to the water table. I mean, you talk to practitioners in the fracturing industry, and quite frankly, they wouldn't mind to see a little further fracturing. Because obviously the longer your fracture, the greater your ability to access natural gas. And you talk to these geologists, and I was actually at a conference in New York last week and a conference in Texas 2 weeks before that. And what you're hearing is that these fractures, the greatest fractures they're getting, the longest, they're 100, 150 feet. Again, so I think there needs to be some sort of, if the answer there is more research into that, that's fine. It seems like we do have the technology, and that work is happening right now, to better map that and better get that information out to the public so we know where the fractures are relative to the water table, and we can take on that question head on. I just want to mention that briefly. I think there are a number of things in Ben's paper that he gets right, frankly. I think very helpful for an American, not really having a good sense of what's the regulatory apparatus up here and what's sort of being considered. I think, first of all, he does a great job of actually explaining what the process is in terms that are not tendentious. We spent a lot of time talking to reporters and talking to folks that sort of come at this issue from a different perspective than we do. And the first thing we sort of get to them is that we're not talking about a drilling process. Essentially we drill the well, and that takes a couple of weeks. And then you fracture the well, maybe it takes a couple of days, and then the remediation process begins. But the fracturing process isn't drilling. People sort of confuse those two things. And again, it's in the very beginning of the stage of the life of that well. Again, a couple of weeks for the drilling, a couple of days for the fracturing, and then essentially you have a producing well for the next 30 or 40 years under the best case scenario. I know, Professor, you might quibble with that question because there is the question of what happens after the first couple of years in terms of the production drop-off, et cetera. A lot of companies have made pretty significant bets that we actually will have enough shale gas to fuel our economy in America and certainly in Canada for generations. And so, the numbers we've seen so far are pretty significant, and that not only in Texas and the Barnett and Woodford in Oklahoma and in Colorado with some of the tight sands out there, and obviously in Pennsylvania where I'm from.